tonight, I knew.
Well, hello, everybody out there in web developer and design land.
Hello.
You are listening. What the hell? No. Yeah, see, now you screwed up my rhythm. You see what you did there? You broke up
Hi,
my
everybody.
intro that I was working so hard on. This is the Drunken UX Podcast. You're listening to episode number 22. 22. It's October. It's the end of October when you're listening to this. Maybe it's November. I don't know. I'm not your boss. We're going to be talking about lessons learned from the HealthCare.gov launch way back in the way back.
Remember when that was the things that we had to worry about? Completely.
Yeah. This episode of the Drunken UX Podcast is brought to you by our friends at NewCloud. You can check them out at newcloud.com/drunkenux. I am one of your hosts. I am Michael Feenan, and with me on the other microphone is Aaron Hill. Aaron,
hello.
Tell the people hi again.
Hi, everybody.
See, we got him a nice microphone, and now he thinks he's a voice actor, so he's getting all antsy in his pantsies.
You should come and tell us about our voice acting on the social media platforms. Twitter.com, Facebook.com/drunkenux. Also connect with us on Slack, drunkenux.com/Slack, and on Instagram, where I still gotta take a picture of my drink. We're Instagram.com/ I think DrunkenUX podcast still, right?
That is what it is still. And this week, I'm keeping it pretty simple. I'm just drinking myself an Arizona sweet tea and some Tito's.
Nice. I've got...
And simple.
I was going to do Di Serrano and Sprite, but my kids drank all my Sprite. So I've got... I
mean, that's better than them drinking all the Di Serrano, right?
Oh my God.
There are two ways that can go.
That's true. So I did, I made some SodaStream seltzer, and then I did some Rosa's lime juice in a shot of Di Serrano. It's actually not bad. I discovered, by the way, that, what was it? Kahlua and root beer are a surprisingly good combination.
I'll just take your word for that.
Not like the commercial A&W Barks kind of root beer, but like the IBC kind of root beer, where it's got like actual like sarsaparilla in it and everything. The vanilla of the Kahlua really complements the vanillins in the root beer. Just give it a shot if you can sometime.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make any promises on that. Let's see. We've talked about our sponsor. We've talked about social media. We've talked about our drinks. And so that means we only got one thing left to do, and that's to get into the show. And I know it's October. It's the end of October. I just tootled my skinny butt back from California. We were, or where I was at, High Ed Web 2018. That's
nice.
The Higher Ed Web Conference of Higher Ed in conference land. I don't know. It was in Sacramento. It's basically 700 of the funnest, smartest people who build websites for universities and colleges and things like that. And
for those of you that don't know, High Ed Web is like the conference if you're a higher ed web professional.
I mean, in my opinion, it's also one of the best web conferences, like just in general. While, of course, their use cases and presentations are certainly going to have a university bend to them, they run like 6 tracks concurrently, so you can, each hour you can change the room you're in and go watch a different subject. But I mean, the quality of the content is super high. You've got people working on, really complex subjects and projects and, as I say, chores, but that, the stuff that you can learn there is just so diverse and useful. And it applies because everybody's, going to work on some of these things at some point, even if they're not in higher ed. So,
Right. The challenges that we face in higher ed digital media is there are a lot of overlap to other industries.
Yeah.
I haven't been to the proper High Ed Web conference, but I've been to, I think, 3 regionals, and they were all really awesome. Similar crowd, as you know.
Yeah.
but small, like fewer tracks and shorter and less extravagant.
Fun people too. I mean, that also needs to be said, because these are folks that they, it's one of those work hard, play harder sort of things. Like, when you're at this conference, you can plan on getting lots of really good food and having lots of fun.
If you, for those of you who've been with us for a while, if you remember back to the Jeff Stevens episode when we talked with him from, he's UFL, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's the one that invented Karaoke Plane, and that was at a High Ed Web conference, I believe. So it's that kind of crowd.
Which has now grown into an actual sponsored event.
I saw an Instagram video of Paul Gilzow from our Build Process 1 dancing at Karaoke Plane, and man, that boy can dance.
He's got some groove to him.
He does.
And he's not afraid to show it.
He is not.
What's on your plate conference-wise?
I just got back from the National Diaper Bank Network Conference. It's the annual conference for diaper banks, which are kind of like food banks, but for like sanitary supplies for adults and children. We pitched our product. We went into production with DiaperBase. I've been project lead on that for about 3 years. And we pitched it, and we got 23 diaper banks sign up already. So my life just suddenly got very interesting.
What was your goal for the signups?
I was hoping for like 10. So like I exceeded my expectations and hopes on that. There's 215 total diaper banks in the country. Not all of them are represented at the conference. But I think that 23 is a good start, and assuming that their experience goes well, they'll certainly tell other ones, and we can pick up more.
I mean, so you basically opened and grabbed 10% of the market.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
Overnight.
Yes.
So
yeah.
that by itself, I mean, that speaks volumes, probably.
Yeah. Having a product that's free helps a lot. So, anyways, it was great. It went awesome. I literally just got back today. So, hopefully, when this airs, we'll be preparing to actually have people start using it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm still looking at maybe going to WordCamp US.
Where is that this year?
I believe it is in Nashville, isn't it?
Okay.
And then I think they switched to St. Louis next year, if my memory is fresh on that. But it's something, with as much WordPress work as I'm doing lately, it's something that I think would be incredibly useful. I think doing it this year after the launch of Gutenberg is going to be interesting. We'll use that word, to say the least. And it's cheap. I mean, it's a very affordable little conference. And we were talking about this to start off with, because, I mean, this is, for me, and my experience is maybe a little different from other folks, but, I don't have access to a large pool of people in my area in terms of, brain power and just camaraderie and all that. So conferences give me a chance to get out and get with like-minded people, talk about these challenges and problems and struggles and things, or find solutions. I can sit down, this Dockerized WordPress stuff that I'm working on right now. It gives me a chance to talk to somebody else who's doing that and say,
cool.
Is the way I'm doing it the way you would do it? Or, am I missing something obvious or making a mistake that's going to come back and bite me? And you get that, you can have that personal feedback cycle that I think is really, always important to have, that professional networking component. And that's true. It doesn't matter what your job is. I think that that's an important thing for people to do professionally.
Definitely.
And you can learn a lot. I mean, these conferences happen for a reason. So
does Chris Weekman go to every WordCampus or WordCamp US, or yeah?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think he's going this year, but I don't know if he has gone every year.
I saw pictures of him on Instagram at WP Camp UT.
Yeah, he's like doing a keynote over in Europe.
Wow, it's crazy. He was also one of our previous guests.
When you know famous
humble
people.
brag.
Swing by our show notes over drunkenux.com. Let us know what conferences either that you go to, that you want to go to, anything that is a goal for you. I think maybe not this year, but I think it would be really neat to go to the Amazon reInvent conference. I think that would be a cool thing to do. That's something that I kind of keep an eye on, and I say not this year, but maybe eventually. But let us know what do you like? What do you want to go to? Or why don't you? Is it is it hard to pay for? Does your work not let you off? I know there's a lot of stuff around that. I talked to somebody this week that was at Hyatt Web who they basically have to save up all of their professional development funds for 2 years, so that on the third year they can afford to go to one conference. And it's like, man, that's rough.
I've talked with organizers before about this. It's an interesting problem because on one hand, you have people who have little funds available for attending conferences, or they're not employed, and so going to conferences is very cost prohibitive. On the other hand, you have people who do have a lot of funds, and so undercharging for the tickets, you're missing out on that potential opportunity. So you have to decide which population you're going to serve while still making sure you have enough funds for your conference.
Yeah, it's tough, and that was something else about Hyatt Web, that all things being equal, I think it's $650 some for 3 days of stuff, and I've always felt like their pricing was actually really reasonable for the amount of conference you get. I went to an event apart earlier this summer, and I want to say that the tickets for that were something in the area of like $1,200.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was for 2 days, but it's one giant session, basically. Like, they don't do extra tracks. They don't have, a ton of speakers. It's just like a lineup of speakers that just come in one at a time.
Yeah.
So it's an extremely, in my eyes, it's a very expensive conference. And yeah, to what you're saying, if you're freelancing or running your own small business or something like that, looking at some of those events that can look very, very expensive. How do you get that money out of that experience at that point?
Right.
And that's challenging. It was like an event apart. It was great. It was a fun deal. I learned a lot. It was really cool to see guys like Zeldman and Myers speak. But I definitely would not have paid for it myself. It was a work-sponsored outing, so they covered that cost for us. But they were full, too. I mean, there was a lot of people at it, so obviously people will pay. So I
went to RailsConf a few years ago, and that was if you're a Rails developer, it's an amazing conference, and you got to go at least once. But holy crap, is it pricey? It's in the thousands. I think it was like $2,000 or something for a ticket. That wasn't including plane fare. Or hotel stay.
I would say for any of our listeners, I set it as a goal. The new year is getting ready to kick up. Find yourself one event in 2019 and go to it. And that can be a one-day event, an afternoon event. It could be a full-size conference. But find one thing that requires you to leave the city you're in and go somewhere else. And maybe if you're in a big city, maybe the leave the city part isn't necessary. But go find an event you haven't been to before and go check it out, and just see what it is, see what it's like, and use that opportunity. Even if you don't end up liking the content, use it as an excuse to talk to other people and make a new friend, find somebody that maybe does what you do, or somebody that can refer people to you. That's something we talk about a lot, and talked with Joel, for instance, about in the episode about starting a business. Knowing people who can refer you stuff is huge. And you can't do that if you aren't getting out and meeting these folks. So even, I know some folks are antisocial or whatever, and that's fine, but take the time.
Even if you go and don't interact with anyone, I have gone to a bunch of different conferences, and I always come away with kind of, my brain feels invigorated from all of the exposure to these all different ideas. Whether or not I agree with them is secondary, because it spurs ideas for me that I'm thinking of while I'm watching them. And it's a great way to really refresh And especially if you're feeling kind of like with your work.
Yeah. So that's the conference side of things. We're getting to the end of the year, so there's that scramble for people to get out and spend their money, but we were one of those. I want to talk this bye week. I don't know how to refer to our show, I guess, when I talk about the show lasts for 2 weeks technically before the next one comes out. Anyway, that's a rabbit hole we don't need to go down. HealthCare.gov. HealthCare.gov. This is the 5-year anniversary of the site. They launched on October 1st, 2013. Most folks are at least in web are at least familiar with the site in passing. If you aren't, it's the insurance exchange website that was set up to support the Affordable Care Act, and infamously launched and promptly smashed face first into a wall, basically.
That's being very charitable.
Yeah, much to no surprise to anybody who was paying attention anyway.
I guess a quick note on this before we get into the actual topic about HealthCare.gov. Open enrollment November 1st. If you are someone who uses the ACA for your insurance, mark that on your calendar and don't forget. November 1st.
November 1st.
Okay.
That's like 4 days from now.
Yeah, that's your PSA. Okay.
But this has led to, there's been a lot written on healthcare.gov, and I think that it's a good story to sit down and look at kind of what happened, why it happened, and then, what we can use there as web developers to kind of figure out, especially, granted, it was a huge website, and many of us will not work on sites that are designed to do what it did. But there's still, I think, a lot of bite-sized nuggets of goodness that you can learn from that and apply to your own projects.
The key complaints I remember hearing were the total cost was really high, and then the performance, like it underperformed and had outages and overages on traffic. And then I think, weren't there some issues about like people finding it hard to use? Like if they could get access, if they could get into it, they finally got a request responded to, and they're using it. Wasn't it hard to use or something?
Right. Yeah. It's it had usability issues. It had technical issues. So just to kind of outline the start of this, the site was designed and built by a small team of federal employees that were augmented with two primary firms. One was a group called CGI Federal, and the other is QSSI. Right. CGI Federal did most of the the design and systems integrations and setup. QSSI was responsible for a lot of the testing and fixing of things. But together, these two organizations are the ones that tend to get all the crap thrown at them for kind of what went wrong, so to speak. CGI Federal is interesting because
they're not even American, right? I mean, they're not United States. They're North American.
They're a Canadian company based out of Montreal.
Okay.
Now that isn't. I mean, they've worked with everybody. CGI is not a small company by any stretch of the imagination. They've worked with China. They've worked with states. They've worked with the U.S. before, and you're familiar. When you are a company that has done work on federal contracts before, you then tend to get preferential treatment for future projects at that point too, because you're a known quantity. So there are a lot of cases where, like they can sidestep things, so to speak, in terms of having to put stuff out for RFPs or anything like that.
On one of the links in our show notes, I saw that they are continuing to still get contracts for healthcare-related websites for the U.S. even after all of this happened.
That's how they got started. Was they had already been doing work for Medicare systems.
Oh, Part D, right?
Yeah. And that contract was $135 million.
Jesus.
So these guys were they're a big player, to say the least.
Holy crap.
And they had done up to this point several state-level websites as well for healthcare exchanges. But I think the thing to note there is, of course, the state requirements were somewhat smaller. The user base was significantly smaller, and you don't have anywhere near the same amount of systems integrations to do that you have on the federal level. So, that was, while they had that kind of in their back pocket, it definitely wasn't representative of the work that was to come, so to speak, I think.
Right. Oh, I was going to ask, do you happen to know what were they doing like waterfall or like agile, or like what was the project management approach for this project?
It appears to have been a type of waterfall that mostly used agile words. So, and because some of their meeting notes and stuff were released through the committee process and all this, and they referred to things like sprints and stuff like that and iterations, but there's no actual indication that it was agile at all.
So it wasn't. So they were doing like sprint planning, but it was like basically just, this is the current portion of the waterfall that we're riding down,
right? And
not like oh, this is working, and then those priorities have changed, and we're gonna adjust and adapt to it in this way.
And I think we'll dig into some of this in the second part, as far as how project management can factor into success or failure. In this case, obviously, kind of failure, but so the wall that they hit, basically, let's talk a little bit about that. So this launched October 1st, 2013, and promptly went down. And one of the initial problems that they noted was that in their testing, there's an NBC News story that we'll link to that mentions some of this, that they found that under a stress test, the site was failing with 1,100 concurrent users, which is not very many. That's a pretty low number as far as a big website goes. And I'll tell you right now, I have stress test, a number of web servers. You throw siege at something, you give it a number of users, and I have cranked up some of those attacks on some of my servers, and I can even get a small server to handle 1,100 people.
So, with, the target audience is ostensibly the entire U.S. population, basically. 1,100 people is 0.000003333% of the population.
I think we mentioned this at one point about Woot.com in one of our past episodes, and the problems they have when they sell a bag of crap and everybody jumps on to try to buy the $5 bag of crap all at once, and their systems go down. There's this surge problem, right? Yeah. And that was part of the issues that that HealthCare.gov was having for users. Was their website by its nature is designed for surging, because everybody is going to come on when it opens. Yeah. And like 12 minutes before the deadline, that's right. And there will be a steady amount in between there, but then on the outside of those gates, your usage is going to probably fall, off a cliff, basically.
I'm guessing the answer to this is probably no, but did they consider looking at the IRS website as a potential case study or at least frame of reference? Because that has a very similar, February to April each year, you're going to have a huge surge of traffic hammering your servers. So
I mean, I don't know. Yeah. That's not something, I didn't see it in any of the
I'm betting the answer
research,
is no, but but that's there at least.
But I mean, that is obviously a problem. They estimated that they were failing at 1,100 users, and the actual traffic demand was apparently something in the area of 50 to 60,000 concurrent users.
Really?
So yeah, I mean, we're talking it could not even handle barely fractional amounts of traffic for what they got.
Yeah, 1,100 is 2% of 50K. Wow. Yeah. Holy shit.
I mean, that's yeah, if you can't serve people, obviously that's a huge issue. It
Right.
also led to latency problems because when it was serving pages, you can imagine every one of these, if I don't know if what they were using on the stack side, but figure every thread that's spinning up for people, depending on what kind of memory system they were using or whatever, you're probably using 3, 4, 5 megs per,
Yeah.
spread that out across 1,100 people. They had pages that were taking anywhere from 8 to 10 seconds to load.
Wow.
And, may or may not completely load in that time. Parts may fail, images may not come because each one of those is another request.
Right.
And so even for the people who were using it, their experience was so degraded that it wasn't useful. You can't, what good is having a shopping cart if you can't check out, kind of thing.
Right. Wow.
There's a lot of integrated stuff here, and I mentioned with CGI Federal, they had done state level sites, but those aren't representative of the kind of work that was needed to be done here, because they of course had registration systems, insurance database systems, application systems, all of this stuff that has to tie in together for an end-to-end user experience. And that was also part of the problem, where they were failing with connections to some of these independent systems. And that's one of those things they did testing on it. And I've said the same thing about Gutenberg, and so have several other folks, that, it's a forest for the trees sort of thing. Like, even if you test the individual things, if you aren't doing good end-to-end testing, it's possible to have something that passes every individual test but still fails.
Right.
When everything is put together. And the appearance is that was one thing that they had a huge gap in test coverage, was they stress tested the website, but they didn't stress test the interconnectivity between their services to make sure that not only can our website handle this, but can we handle all of the database connections, the API lookups, and all of this stuff.
Right.
And clearly they didn't.
That's a tricky thing to think about. I mean, I would expect for the size of that contract that they should have had people on hand who would have thought ahead about things of that nature, especially seeing all of the coupling with the other services. But it's still kind of a weird thing. Like, it's easy to sort of imagine your site is just working in a vacuum, or at least being where you only have to worry about your own performance, not the performance of ancillary services.
I would have loved to be able to be like, a fly on the wall kind of thing, sitting in one of those, the planning meetings, especially like in the 2 months or so leading up to launch.
Yeah.
Like, I can only imagine the kind of panic that was probably there, and particularly on the part of the developers, because when you're a developer, that something is not going to work right.
Usually, yeah.
Or I mean, you, especially at something like this, like, you're going to be aware that there is a limit to what it's going to be able to do, or something like that, and you're going to see that truck coming. But and this is another thing I won't go too deep into, because we'll save it for the second half. But there was a hard deadline here. This wasn't a get it right and then release it. It has to be done by October 1st.
Yeah.
It is, there was a legally mandated deadline there, and it certainly would have been nice if they could have done it faster. I think that, if they had, it would have given them some soft launch opportunity. Yeah. But they didn't. And when you have that kind of train coming at you as a developer, you see it. You know that this stuff is not going to go right. And I can only imagine the feeling in that room. Because they know it's like, we can't stop it. And I'll keep bringing up Gutenberg. It feels very much like that idea of not having the power to say, you know what, we can't launch this yet. It's not going to be ready.
Yeah.
But you can't. And that's the reality. I've made this kind of argument to people too about, things like accessibility and stuff, that there's always that problem of the real world when you are in a job working at a company or whatever. Sometimes it's just the way it is, so to speak. You have to get something done, and that sucks. But it is the reality of the way business works, and it's not unique to web development. It happens in accounting, it happens in HR, it happens, there are things that are happening that you just have to beat the drum to, and you get better by figuring out how to time that tempo and rhythm. So it is worth, I think, pointing out, at the end of the day, the site that launched, it wasn't an ugly site. Like their problems were purely technical.
And I want to touch on that point. It's really easy to look at a site that has shitty design, and when I say design, I mean specifically aesthetics, not UX. It's easy to look at a site that has shitty design and kind of infer from that it's a bad site. And it's also easy to look at a site that has really good design and incorrectly infer that it's a good site.
Yeah.
I've seen, like, I've worked on sites before where like the design layer was being worked on independently of the development side. And so the other devs and I were working on the views and the back end stuff and everything, and it looks like shit. Like it's basically, if you can imagine, a worse looking version of Craigslist. Like it would be like super basic. And then the designer's like, okay, we got the first run done, and they'll like just slapped up the CSS, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, now the site's great.
And I would encourage folks, if you're listening to this episode, go back to the Wayback Machine. In fact, I'll just throw a link in our show notes for it. To like day one when this thing opened, and go take a look at it. And it's like, if you were to look at this site, and you're right, I said their problems were purely technical. That's maybe unfair, because they did have usability problems as well, for the people who were getting in. But design wise, strictly look and feel, you would look at it and you'd be like, okay, yeah, it's not like flashy, it's not going to win any awards or anything like that, but
right,
they got there. One of the funny things though about it is we, talking about that train coming down the tracks, as you get to that deadline, and you can see it. Some folks do what they do, which in this case, they were tearing apart some of the code that was running the site, and so they pulled some JavaScript files and things like that, and found like placeholders that were still in the code for like notes or to-dos or
wow,
lorem ipsum type things. Like the code had clearly not been scrubbed. And this is before, like, we aren't really using build processes or things like that at this stage of the game, so that was still very early for any of that. So this is stuff that somebody manually in their head had said, okay, we're gonna make these notes so that my other developers see it, and then when we go live, we'll go back and take all this stuff out. But the time to go live came well before the opportunity to take it out, and that's kind of a telling marker of how that process went and the opportunities that weren't there. And that's why I say, like, as a developer, you know that stuff is still in that code. You're not going to forget that you've left debug comments and things like that, all over the place. Yeah. So it's a shame, and it comes back to a lot of those developers, but really at the end of the day, this was a huge just project management nightmare is really what it comes down to. And it was an expensive one.
The other part of that too, like, the difference between like the design side and then the development side, you give management design comps, and you've basically given them like 80% of the work, and that they have to do the CSS and everything and actually do the page layouts, but that's a purely time problem. There's not a lot of problems you're solving. You're just grinding code. But if you show someone a site that's like, where you've been working on the back end, the problems or how close you are to the finish line is not immediately apparent. And so for management especially, it's easy for them to see differences in the design or like the progress of the design, but not as easy to see it in the development side.
Yeah. So let's talk about one more piece of this puzzle, which is I mentioned this was an expensive project management nightmare.
You said the previous ones were 135 million.
The work that CGI had done for Medicare was clocked in at 135 million. Now I don't know what that is inclusive of. I want to just be fair about that. Like I don't know if that was. I doubt it was just web design. I'm sure there was systems integrations. There may have been application development. I don't know. For this, and this is one of those things that like there isn't like a hard, fast number like this is what it cost, but there have been some numbers thrown around as far as what Kathleen Sebelius had said, and what the Government Accounting Office and those folks have put out. The basic estimate is that up to and through the initial launch, it was somewhere in the area of about $174 million. And that has grown in scope over time, possibly as high as $319 million and maybe more.
Holy shit. That's nearly twice. It's nearly doubled in size?
It doubled in size for reasons. Wow. I think the thing that blows my mind here is trying to understand what that cost goes towards. Because I get it. Like, this is a big site, and it has to serve a lot of people and do important things. But if you're going to tell me that the cost of that is $174 million, I've got to ask the question of who is getting raked over the coals here. And obviously it's the taxpayers. I'm not going to go into a political rant on that, but it is the idea that this was the most cost-effective way to make this happen is kind of feel like it's, patently absurd is probably the phrase to put it.
Well, as someone that works on a government contract, you have like the flat costs of licensing fees and technology and hosting fee or whatever else, all the DevOps stuff. But then you've got the much bigger cost is almost certainly going to be the labor side, which is, you're paying the salaries for all the developers, and the salaries are not a function of the quality of what they're producing or anything. And it can't be. I'm not saying that that's a problem.
I think the way to put this into perspective, even though we don't know how many folks, in total were on this project, but, we're not talking about building an operating system. We're not talking about Microsoft or some company that's got 1,000 developers that are all, putting their hands into the pie. Even a large web project is going to max out, let's say, 20 people between designers, developers, project managers, content writers, SEO, all this stuff. You could pay every single one of those people $1 million for their work and still have $150 million left over for all of your hardware needs and technical requirements and license. I mean, that's the way I kind of look at this is if I could go out and hire 20 people and pay them $1 million, I mean, I could literally hire the best web developer on the planet.
Okay, so something to think about, and this isn't immediately obvious, but if you are a government contractor and you're getting a government contract, you're not the money that you're securing for the contract isn't being applied directly to your contractors. Like, let's say that you had 20 developers and each one of them was getting, we'll say $100,000 a year or something. It's not, the contract isn't for $2 million a year, because you also have to have, the profit that your contractor company is making, and that profit. And then you also have like your own overhead costs of paying executive salaries and paying for other things that your revenues have to cover, in addition to just paying for the people doing the work.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, that's always going to be true. I think the bottom line is, if anybody pays $174 million for anything, it should work. I mean, that's really the most important piece of that statement. I mean, there's just no way you spend that kind of money and have a site break.
I think anyone who's paying for anything deserves to be given a functional product.
Yeah.
Like, if you've agreed on a price.
That's the real crime in all of this,
Yeah.
is that idea that, you know, after all of that, like, if it had rolled out flawlessly and worked end to end and done all the things, yeah, we might still be talking about how expensive it was, but at least we got the money's worth out of it. And, you know, you'd mentioned it basically doubled in cost in support time up to this estimated $319 million number. And most of that has come on the back of support and fixing and firefighting after the fact. And so that initial badness is what led to the explosion in additional costs to fix that. And so that's the cost of building something badly. And in this case, I can't ever imagine building something so badly that it would have these kind of numbers.
So
it's unbelievable.
Did you see The Martian or read it? I guess either one.
I saw it. I want to read it. I can't find
the book's
any
really
version
good
of it.
I think I've got it. Anyway, it's really good. The book is excellent. But you remember, I guess minor spoilers if you haven't seen it. You remember when they're sending up the support like rocket with all the support food so that Watney can survive another 2 years or whatever on Mars?
Right.
And then the thing blows up.
Yeah.
But like the reason it blew up was because they had a hard deadline that got pushed forward. It was already untenable. And then in order to make the critical window they had to make, they had to like cut down on QA and testing and everything. And then ultimately it happened to be like, you know, the director of NASA, he made a judgment call and he's like, well, in cases like these, we only find problems, 10 or 20% of the time. So it's 80% likely to succeed. It just happened to be that in this case it failed. I think that's a similar kind of thing with this. They had a hard deadline and they were told you have to release it by this point, and it just wasn't ready. And when I worked in higher ed, we occasionally would get hard deadlines like that because of the academic cycle. And sometimes the stuff just isn't ready, and you know, things take time to fix. I don't know what to do about that, other than maybe to tell management to understand that things take time.
Well, I've got advice for that, which is let's take a break. We'll come back in about 45 seconds, refill our glasses, and then we will discuss exactly what we can do about some of this stuff.
We're gonna solve it. Let's solve it tonight.
We're gonna solve it in the next 30 minutes of this show, and
Yeah.
While I'm out, let's figure out how much of that $174 million we get for 30 minutes.
Yeah. I think we're going to set a hard deadline for 30 minutes for us, and we're going to have a solution by the end of it. That's
the lesson. Stick around. Okay. We'll be right back in just a few. The Drunken UX podcast is brought to you by our friends at NewCloud. Are you trying to build a case around an interactive map for your school, city, or business? NewCloud's interactive map platform gives you the power to make and edit a custom interactive map in just minutes. Their team of professional cartographers specialize in map illustrations and are ready to design a rendering to fit your exact needs. One map serves all your users' devices with responsive maps that scale and blend in seamlessly with your website. Visit them online to request a demo at nucloud.com/drunkenux. That's nucloud.com/drunkenux. Okay, so I did the math, and I think that of that $174 million, we should get approximately 1% of it. So we'll get $1.74 million, and we'll put some of that back into the podcast. You can go on vacation, and I'll take the rest. I think that's fair.
That'd be all right.
That work for you?
I'll let you know what my vacation is.
Okay. In looking up some of this information over the break, I also picked up another little juicy fact that just kind of blew my mind.
What's that?
In fact, as I think about this, I'm not even entirely sure how this can be true, given what we know, but supposedly the website has 500 million lines of code that runs it.
What?
Yeah, you tell me how I don't like I know that that's inclusive, that we're talking about all the connectors, all the database stuff, all of the application server side stuff. I have no doubt that that's all being included in that. But even then, obviously a lot of that is just libraries and things being included, because there's no way that humans wrote 500 million lines of code for this project in the time it had. It's just,
so it might be some bloat. But even so, it's running on PHP, by the way. I looked at the network traffic when it's coming in.
It's just, I mean, how do you maintain that even? 500 million lines of code. How do you maintain something of that size and get test coverage on all of it?
Right. Oh my god. Even if half of it was from, let's say, even if 3/4 of it was from libraries and other things that were like third-party code, that's still 125 million lines of code.
Yeah, I've never had to build a site that big. I mean, obviously, I kind of, and now I kind of wonder what like the average size of one of my websites is. Even if, you include something like all the WordPress code. So, I mean, when we think about WordPress, just to give people some perspective, WordPress, as far as just a site tool, has under 500,000 lines of code. It's in the area of 419,000 lines.
The Space Shuttle had 400,000 lines of code. A bacteria, the syphilis bacteria, has just over 1 million. They're calling it lines of code. I'm guessing they mean base pairs.
Like, yeah.
Age of Empires Online has a little over 1 million. Firefox web browser has just shy of 10 million.
We're still talking fractional numbers of 500 million. That's the thing. Like, what could all of that be possibly doing?
Okay, Google, all internet services, 2 billion lines of code. A step below that is a car software of an average modern high-end car has about 100 million
That's
lines.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so they basically got 5 cars worth, or like 1% of Google.
So, getting away from that exercise, as fun as it was, let's talk about the important side of this. So,
wait, Facebook is 60 million.
So they built 10 Facebooks. That's
basically
dumb.
And Facebook, and I mean, I'm only mentioning Facebook because it's here, but also because Facebook has how many concurrent users? Like they're not choking on 1,100. So clearly, I mean, the lines of code isn't a good indicator for that, but like, Facebook managed to do it.
You know what lines of code is a good measure for, though? Is QA and testing. Because every line of code is an opportunity for a bug. It's an opportunity for a typo. It's something you have to test. So every line of code you add to something is a little bit more complexity that can break stuff.
Yes.
So, I mean, and for anybody that's wondering, HealthCare.gov did get hacked in 2014. It wasn't like a major data breach or anything like that, as far as I know, but it was compromised. So when you start adding that complexity, that's the risk you run. So the big risk, and we've talked about the cost and how part of that cost growth was the result of support. Joanne Peters was a spokeswoman for HHS. She had a comment at one point where she said, moving forward, the team is focused on diagnosing and fixing each tech issue as it is identified.
What?
There's another name for that. It's called firefighting.
Right.
And that is, even though it is sort of the norm in terms of how we deal with problems with websites, you're always going to have to work that way. That was the strategy at the time. And that is a really bad way to try to address 500 million lines of code that can be broken.
Yeah.
Because it means you are constantly running around playing whack-a-mole instead of focusing on the entire experience and trying to address like the holistic problems as far as performance and things like that go. You can only throw so many people at that kind of problem.
You shouldn't. I think the key part there is that as it is identified, that it's okay to have that come up if it's like a thing here and there, but you should be knowing what those problems are before you go into production.
Obviously, we can't say build bug-free code because that's not a thing. We can't do that. But you do need to go in with that mentality of, hey, we got, Jim this week is gonna take this sprint and do some bug whacking while the rest of us, focus on, memory consumption in our, in the JavaScript stack or something like that, as far as whatever. That's a strategy, but they had so much to deal with that there was no other, they couldn't tear the site down and rebuild it at that point. You had to kind of push it to be better, but it leads to 174 million becoming 319 million.
Right.
Becoming, I just saw another number here as I click around some of these notes that the entire cost has possibly reached as high as 1.7 billion.
Oh my god.
Since inception. So
10 times as big.
Yeah, just to put that into perspective, how those costs grow over time. But there needs to be strategy to how you go at something. And if you know, like if you launch something and you know that there is a problem, then there needs to be sort of a stepping away period.
Yeah.
And here's what I would have told them.
It's where you get your money's worth.
They had a deadline, and we'll talk about deadlines here in a second. But they had this deadline they were marching towards, but it was still arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
And, it can be really unfortunate to have to go in and say we need to change the deadline, but they could have. It would have taken an act of Congress, like literally.
Or they could have adopted an actual agile practice, figured out what the MVP was. How many features do you actually need on October 1st? If you identify like, okay, from October to November 1st, people are going to want to look up their healthcare things, but they don't have to actually sign up for stuff yet because they can't until November 1st. Then you can just make sure that you have performance accuracy for those features that they actually need.
Yeah, because the whole idea, and for folks that have never worked in Agile or worked with a team that way, part of the goal is to build the individual features completely and release those iteratively. So you would start with, okay, well, first thing we need is a place for a user to register.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would make the button, and then you would make the form that fills out to create the record.
Mm-hmm.
And, you would save that record. You'd go item by item. Each time you grow that little bit, then you would say, okay, yeah, we need a way to look up the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd be like, okay, we need a search form, something. And you build that up to that level of MVP.
MVP meaning minimum viable product, by the way.
Yeah. Most places, you'll still have scope creep and things like that. But the idea is to get you to that point of, we hit MVP and it is functional.
Yeah.
It should work through and through when you get there and do those baseline things. And then you can start iterating more sprints. You're testing the whole way through. If something comes up and you get to that point where it's like, oh yeah, there's a bug in X, then you address it then. You take it to your people, you get stakeholder approval, you make sure they're happy, you come back, and then you do the next thing, and you just keep working that cycle. It looks like what they did was much more of this waterfall process, which is just like, the planning leads to the design, leads to the development, leads to the testing, leads to the release, leads to maintenance.
Right.
But the problem with that is, and there's one of the articles we have a link to, I'm not sure which one it is, so I can't tell you directly, but one of them is going to talk about this. And they make the point that, when you work in waterfall in particular, the testing phase isn't really a testing phase.
No.
Because when you test it and you find the broken things, it actually becomes a fixing phase.
Yeah.
And it happens so late in the process.
Yeah.
That if you find something really bad, really like if they got to the testing phase and then we're like, okay, now we'll run Siege and we'll throw, 50,000 users at this thing. Oh, it's crashing. Now you have to figure out, do we have enough time left to fix that problem?
How many, you've probably encountered this before. Have you ever had an application that you've written where you approached it with a particular paradigm or model or something, and then you're actually executing it, and then when you're testing it early on, because you're smart, you realize like, oh, my assumptions about this were completely wrong, and this isn't going to work. So then you can then refactor and reapproach it early on. Well, it's still easy to do that. But imagine if you didn't discover that until you're in the testing phase at the end.
And the same thing goes for, exactly why you should be doing user testing the whole way through,
right?
To solve some of that, to know that, oh, the thing I'm building, because remember, it also had usability problems for people. They had trouble navigating the system, signing up, and doing all their work.
Okay, now, regarding that, whether you're doing Agile or Waterfall, there is a discovery period in the beginning. How did they not anticipate the volume? I mean, I could have said, if they were like, oh, we think it'll have 10,000 concurrent users, and turns out they were off by it's 50K or whatever, I'll give them that. But 1,100?
This is so here's the next part, which is when you're doing your discovery, when you're building something, particularly a tool that is going to have surge potential, you need to make sure that you are designing it for good horizontal scaling.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be able to widen its base, spin up a couple more load balancers or whatever, if you're using EC2 or DigitalOcean or something like that.
Yeah.
In something like this, they probably did have to have physical hardware, so I'm sure there was probably some limitation there. But at the same time, that's going to happen. So you should be building that kind of scaling in, because that
right.
90% of the time it's going to be sitting there with very low volume, and then you need to be able to turn the fire hose on.
Right.
That was a requirement. There's no way that's a requirement that you don't know ahead of time on something like this. And even if you're building a small tool, this matters because, for instance, I use DigitalOcean to build my sites right now.
Mm-hmm.
I set up a droplet, and I'm setting up small droplets, like 2 gigs of memory.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a whole lot to run a web server on, but it can be done with little tweaking and stuff. It runs just fine.
Yeah.
But I'm running, I think, 3 sites on one of those,
mm-hmm.
and so I've had to think about, okay, what happens when I post an article? What happens when a new episode of the podcast goes up?
Right.
And knowing that if I am running lean, I need to know what my server's capability is and what I want to do about that, so that if I surge, I can get that.
Like
used to call
the hug of death, the Reddit hug of death.
Yeah, exactly where I was going at. If you got the /dot effect.
Yep. The Reddit hug. Reddit is a news aggregator website. It's not just news; it's all kinds of internet shit. But the hug of death is when something gets posted there, and a lot of people are very interested in it in a very short amount of time. Essentially, internet hugging, and they're all loading your website, and your website just can't handle that surge of traffic, and so it tanks.
Yeah. So it does, like in this case, obviously the site was huge, and that was a problem, and they should have known. But that applies to you at a small scale too,
mm-hmm.
because you'll always have to consider that, whether that means you're adding caching,
mm-hmm.
Whether you use a CDN or a proxy to take care of that. Whether you build a service that literally can go up and be like, well, I need to spin up another server for the next hour.
Yeah.
And load balance that way. Netflix has a lot of services like that for video distribution. They can bring up and shut down nodes as demand goes up and down.
And they also run, I think we've talked about this before, the Chaos Monkey. It's just a program that lives in their server land, and it just randomly kills and processes. And they did a whole talk at a conference about the Chaos Monkey, and but it's constantly running in production, so they're always creating like that kind of nightmare scenario where stuff is dying, but because that's running, they have to design for redundancy. And that's why you can watch whatever it is show you likes to watch.
And I think you could make a really good argument that government services should be running that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, when we think about something like HealthCare.gov in particular, that period from, November 1st to December 1st or whatever it is, or December 31st when it closes, I mean, and it just like IRS, you brought up the IRS earlier. Their period there in the middle of April, that needs to be bulletproof for them, because they are providing a service that is incredibly important.
Right.
And if I can't do the thing because your stuff failed, a lot of the times, that's my fault, actually, as the user.
Didn't they have an outage on April 15th this year?
Yes.
And wasn't it surge related?
I don't know. I don't remember the details at this point. I didn't think ahead to that. But
I remember tax day got bumped to the 16th.
I think it was related specifically to e-filing. Like, place, like I use Tax Act, or people who are using H&R Block or any of these that that e-file your stuff. I think it was that part of it that went down, but and that was a huge deal, because that was what everybody's like, well, I'm trying to get my stuff in early, but you're not going to give me credit for that if your stuff was broken, because that's just the way government works. And so you say, did they add an extra day to it?
They did. They extended the tax day, became the 16th instead.
Okay.
Because of the outage.
And so let's talk deadlines on this. Mm-hmm. So they had a hard deadline. It had to launch October 1st, 2013. And I get that. And I think my first point is there are a few deadlines that have to be written in stone. And I know that I said that earlier, that it would have taken an act of Congress, literally, to change this, but that could have been done. And maybe. I would argue it. Well, I mean, here's what I would have said. I think it's arguable that it should have been part of the original legislation, that the goal was October 1st, 2013, whatever, but there needed to be an escape hatch of some kind there or something. Like, it's never good on something like this to impose that kind of deadline, because you get exactly what happened, basically. I mean, let's just call that what it is.
Like, deadlines exist independently of what the project is. The problem is that, again, I'm going to go back to the MVP thing. Had they identified, these are the features we need to have on this date, it may not be the full feature set. There may be parts of the project that don't need to be feature complete on that date. And so you could prioritize and refocus your efforts on just the ones that have to be, like, have 100% uptime when that happens. And I think that is something that Agile is better with than Waterfall approach. Because Waterfall wants to have the whole painting done, and Agile is just like,
Waterfall is, it's trying to hit a target a mile away.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to aim at a target and launch a project at it and hope you hit it, or hit in front of it, I guess, technically. But if you realize you are overshooting or something, there's not a good way to change the trajectory at that point. Whereas
you have to move the target.
with Agile, the whole thing is like, if you're doing something in Agile, even on a big project, in theory, you will know way ahead of time that you're going to miss a deadline or something's going to go wrong.
Right.
And that gives you time to figure out what you want to do about it.
Right.
In this case, like you say, because you can't complete the project till the whole thing is done with Waterfall, you run into this challenge of, okay, but now we're at the end of the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do?
Agile, like actual Agile, also has built-in things when you're finishing those sprints. I'm gonna dial back a second. So I worked in higher ed on a project that was, like, I'm making air quotes, Agile managed, but what it really was more like what it sounds like this was, which is a waterfall project that's divided up into sprints, and then the sprints are basically just, you have a weekly stand-up meeting where you discuss what you're going to work on that week. But if you're doing actual Agile, when you decide what is going to be in this iteration, and then when those features are complete, whatever it is you're working on, the state of that you're intending to get to, those can then be tested. And then you're testing them, and then you can say, like, this does or doesn't work, and you're testing a much smaller set So when things go awry, you have a better sense of like, well, it's probably something in one of these changes that we made.
And it's important, I think, for project managers and stakeholders to think about deadlines in some of these terms too, because I mean, obviously we have to have deadlines. There are a million reasons why that's true. But it's things have to release. We get that. But I think there needs to be sort of a softer approach to some of that. That go back to WordPress, right? Gutenberg's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big complaints about the accessibility stuff right now is that they canceled their external audit search because they said it no matter what that audit found, it would not change the release date. And that's problematic because that audit could find a showstopper, right? It could find a bug that needs to delay the project.
Well, it's only a showstopper if you stop the show.
Yeah. But that can happen at any point. And so I think there needs to be sort of a soft touch with some deadlines that it's like if there isn't enough time, there just isn't enough time.
Mm-hmm.
Or if a deadline is coming up and you aren't ready, then you need to be prepared to do another thing. In this case, if you know this train is coming down the tracks and you're looking at your code and you're like, we haven't even taken debug comments out yet. This stuff breaks when it gets hammered with a traffic surge. Then it's time to figure out what do we do instead. Maybe you put a message on the site. Maybe, I don't know. But you do something at that point.
If you know the feature isn't complete yet, then, don't deploy it to production, but put up whatever you have that is complete, and then just indicate this feature will be here soon, or something like that. If the user is going to be expecting it, then indicate that you are aware the user is expecting it, but don't give them something broken.
Yeah.
Or at least something you haven't tested.
Giving them something broken and not telling them to expect, sadness is kind of like going to a car lot and buying a car and finding out like it was a Katrina car or something like that, that they didn't tell you. Like, you are intentionally setting them up for failure.
Yeah.
And that, you want to talk about something that will piss off a user faster than anything. Setting them up for failure is a prime way to do it. There's a article I'll attach to from right after the launch from Nielsen Norman, and they did a little thing. They looked at a bunch of the usability guidelines that weren't followed in terms of what would make a good user experience, and so there's a lot of stuff there that shows like, all of these things are going to piss off the user, and so and they're not like weird off the beaten path kind of things. Like, these are conventions that users expect. And things that even in 2013, we knew, was good user behavior, good user experience, and were things that could have been built in.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, because they literally wrote the article 3 weeks after the thing launched. So,
well, if you're on a waterfall project and you discover, let's say that you are a responsible person who is unfortunately on a waterfall project, and you discover there's obvious usability issues with this thing that we just built, we need to address those. How do you work that into? Do you just say this is a blocker, or, I mean, how do you work that into the plan? Because the Gantt chart or whatever is not going to have, we're going to address usability projects at each iteration. Because they're not doing iterations.
I think you have to have an advocate, right?
Yeah.
It has to be a part of your team and a part of your philosophy that you are going to include user experience design and testing in your process. It's not something you can really bolt on.
Right.
It's not something you do after the fact. I mean, you can, obviously, but it's problematic.
It sounds like you kind of almost have to have some like fuzzy space built into whatever plan. So when you're doing resource allocation, you're not saying like, we're going to take 100% of the work hours that we have available and count on those to be available. You'd have to say, well, 80% of these will be working on pushing the project forward, and then 20% is for accommodating stoppages or other things that come up.
Yeah,
I'm just spitballing those numbers. I don't know if that's the good ratio or not.
And I think one of the important things there too is that's not something you have to make up.
Mm-hmm.
At least if you're good.
Right.
If you're working with a team of people that you trust and you know you've been working with for a long time, even when you know you need to leave fuzzy space, you know it's not so much fuzzy space as it is like a pair of jeans that have that little stretchy part in the middle, so that when my fat ass tries to put them on in the morning or after a dinner,
it's so you can deal with surge sizing on Thanksgiving.
Yeah, exactly. But you don't need you don't need 6 inches of that. You only need a little bit. And if you are used to working, you know you'll get a feel. You know, it's a very kind of it's a temperature kind of thing. You know you need a couple hours, you know, for a given type of work.
Yeah.
To plan for whatever testing or changes or things you need. To that point, kind of one of the other problems they had was, I used the word earlier, scope creep. Mm-hmm. And this is something that if you've worked with any kind of, you know, if you're a freelancer in particular who just works with people on the side, you've probably ran into, oh, but could we move this over here?
Right.
Oh, yeah, and by the way, I need the date to show up on X.
Mm-hmm.
6 months into a project, you realize you should have been done 2 months ago, you know? But you've allowed these little things to keep happening, and that was happening here. QSSI, one of the testing company that was brought in, one of their guys, Andrew Slavit, I don't know. He mentioned, it appears that one of the reasons for the high concurrent volume at the registration system was a late decision requiring consumers to register for an account before they could browse for insurance products.
Such a terrible, why? Don't do that.
So, yeah, so what you're seeing here is somebody decided, oh, they should have their account before they're allowed to browse, and so late in the game, they made a change that they weren't able to fully user test, they weren't able to, you know, ask people about. It changed the dynamic of where load was sent within the system, and broke things. And in fact, this exact thing is one of the bullet points that Nielsen Norman Group released in their article.
That's not surprising.
That they're like, there's no reason you should ask a user to create an account in order to browse.
Right.
Browsing is not something that you need to know who the user is at that point. They are browsing. They aren't buying. You don't need to ask for that information because you don't need it. You could make it possible, certainly, if they want to give the information over there, but you don't need it. But those last minute changes,
right?
It comes back to MVP. It comes back to testing. It comes back to Agile. If somebody wants to change something, that's great. Put in a ticket and deal with it the right way. Do discovery on it. Figure out why. What's the user story? What is the user story that says, oh, but we need to make them register first? Like, you need to set all that stuff up, and then you will put it into a future sprint where it will get included as a new feature release somewhere after the fact. Because as far as MVP goes, clearly that is not something that should or would need to be required in order to complete the user task. So that's, you know, that's a prime example of this specific late game change was part of exactly what led to it being broken.
Yeah.
That could be avoided, and it's easy to avoid. I want to go one more place because I want to give some credit to some folks. There is a new department. I guess they're kind of a department. I don't know if that's maybe the right way to put it.
USDS?
The USDS.
Yeah.
The United States Digital Services. So this is a group, and my understanding of it is they've got like their core team, but then they have this whole big staple of developers and designers and user experience people that come in that do like it's almost like Peace Corps kind of work. Like these are folks who come in and they'll be there. They'll put in a term of a year or something like that. Right. And I mean they get paid and all of that too. But as it is structured, the service is designed to help people get experience, but you know improve government services and user experience. They were just coming into being at this point in time, and they were also part of the team that came in after everything went to shit and helped get it put together right. And they have gone on to do. They've been working with VA has been a big piece of what they've been doing lately. They're going around government services, and they can basically say, oh yeah, we can give you a team of 5 people for X long. They're kind of like their own little agency, like a design agency, but for government. And they are working with contractors and with the branches, different departments of government to elevate and improve the user experience design across the board. And they're doing a relatively good job at that. I've talked with some folks at it, and they really are like, they're going at it.
I looked at the guidelines they had. It's really good. I mean, it's like, it's legitimately good recommendations, and having that be a kind of a common language, I guess, like a common scheme that people can use on government websites. I actually check with my team to see if we're using this, because I like it a lot, and this is very clean and it's consistent, and it'll make it easier for people who have learned one government service on the web to use other ones. So less onboarding.
What Aaron is referring to is the United States Web Design System, and we will include a link to it in the show notes. Definitely go check it out. It is on GitHub. You can go pull the entire system. It's a design system. It's just like if you were to go look up something like material design or something like that.
It seems kind of like how Bootstrap is. If you use the default Bootstrap thing and you have like BTN primary, BTN secondary, and so on, and there's pre-made colors, and you just know, that those styles are going to be defined.
It's a pattern library.
Used. Yeah. Yes.
That's what it is. And so the USDS is the part of the team, along with a bunch of folks they collaborated with. They put this together, and this kind of, it's sort of a side effect, I think, of the HealthCare.gov fixing and rebuilding and whatnot, that they have produced this exactly for what you were saying. It's sort of designed to help government use a common language across their websites. And I think that particularly if you are somebody who uses one government service, it's probably likely that you will use several.
Yeah.
And over, the course of a couple years, 2-3 years, you're likely to use at least something. And if we can get government services conforming to this across the board, it unifies that user experience across all of those sites. So you begin to know what you're in for. You know what something's going to look like. You know what the expectation is. You are creating a consistent experience. That's really important, I think, for something like government that is huge. One big piece of the web design system is USWDS. I need a better way to say that. It also includes things like accessibility.
Yeah.
And we know, government's biggest problem, it's true in higher ed, it's true in, the one biggest problem.
One problem
is particularly in web, and I don't mean to say this as a slight against anybody, because I know there are great people doing good work for all of these places, but the reality is government can't compete for the really top-tier web folks a lot of the times. Those people go off, they get an offer from a private company that pays twice as much, they go. And that's just the way it works. Government's not competing for those people, and people have trouble with the bureaucracy, they have trouble with, any number of things. I had a great conversation with somebody that works for the Naval Academy. They're a school, but they are basically bound by the same security and software standards as a battleship.
Right.
Which is insane. And it takes a special person to be like, I can put up with that for a long time. And so things like accessibility, things like usability are often forgotten or not treated with the amount of respect that the process would otherwise demand. And so this gives you a way to kind of get that stuff worked in a little bit more easily, I think, that things are already, they've already tested components, they've already accounted for accessibility, they've already included the controls and the design.
Turnkey.
So, it gives you something turnkey, and it lets you kind of account for that lack in some of those areas. Because let's face it, there are government websites that to this day are just bad. If you know anybody who is a serviceman or a servicewoman, ask them how their experience is with some of the portals that they have to use.
Oh my gosh.
And that's something USDS is actively working on as well with the Army and different branches of the military. But, I mean, there's just a lot of bad that's out there still. Well, it's going to take a long time to fix.
So the other thing I like about design systems is that it pre-makes a bunch of decisions so that you don't have to make them, or someone else doesn't have to do what they think you should do. It's just like, this discussion is settled. We've all decided it's this, end of story. And then you just say like, okay. And the nice thing is that since government websites don't have to compete, with a visual or anything kind of aesthetic style that you might want to have input on those decisions about, they just have to have something that's functional. You don't need anything fancy. You can focus completely on, does this look reasonably nice, and more importantly, does it do what it's supposed to do in a way that is accessible, as you were saying earlier. And this does a great job of that.
Yeah, people come to a government website to do something,
right?
Always.
Yeah.
And so giving them an experience that lets them get in, do the thing they're there to do, and get out with minimum disruption to their day, that's the goal. I mean, that's the key. And by using a design system like this across all of those platforms, then you make that easier across the board, because, again, they know what to expect at that point.
Right. Yes.
So I absolutely
do check it out. Really.
Yeah. Go look at it. Go see what they're doing. It's, if nothing else, it's a great example if you're just trying on your own to build a pattern library or a style guide.
Yeah, you could adopt this if you're ambivalent about the design for whatever reason, or just maybe you internally. I don't think there's any reason you couldn't adopt this, right? Public domain.
I mean, it's check it out on GitHub and run with it.
Yeah.
And I'm almost positive that for the most part, HealthCare.gov does now use that framework. I should have maybe thought ahead and confirmed that, so I can't say it with 100%, but it does definitely appear visually to be using it. So it's something that I think is worth a look and worth playing with, and consider, how design systems speed things up. They, like you say, they remove questions. You don't have to have that conversation of what should this form look like. You know what the form should look like because it's already patterned out for you. There's a whole lot that can do for a project. It also, it eliminates potential hurdles.
Mm-hmm.
If you've done enough design, like rapid prototyping, you can get into some of that. And that, when you get into Agile, becomes really useful if you can jump into a swarm with a stakeholder and be talking about a feature and mock it up real fast because you've got a design system. You just throw a couple classes on something and you can be like, is this what you were wanting? Does this look basically like what you're after? And they're able to give you that feedback cycle. Because Agile's all about feedback. It's like it's this constant feedback cycle between designers, developers, stakeholders, and users. And so design systems make all of that easier because you just know, you're all speaking. Again, I like the way you put it. You're speaking the same language then.
Mm-hmm.
And it reduces the urge of a stakeholder to come in and say, yeah, but I want this to be purple.
The other nice thing too is that for the contractor standpoint, if you work on one project that uses this design system, the next time you work on a project that also uses the design system, you already know all the classes and the styles and how everything is supposed to look because it's the same. So that reduces the amount of developer hours you have to spend on those issues, which should reduce cost, maybe.
Design systems won't fix server problems.
No.
It won't solve the issue of 500 million lines of code necessarily, but those are challenges for another world. I'd be interested to know if they've reduced some of that. Like, is it 400 million now? I don't know. As
an aside, when you talk about the number of lines of code an application has, Should you include third-party libraries? I don't think you should.
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Because that's not the system's code, basically.
Right. And you have no control over that either.
But it's also, I think, probably how you count lines of code usually is just by, looking in GitHub or something like that. So if it's
maybe
in there, you'd have to go in and like exclude directories or something. I don't know.
You could just do. You could just do like WC-L star or whatever. I don't know.
Well, with that, stick with us. We'll be right back after these short messages. The Drunken UX podcast is brought to you by our friends at NewCloud. NewCloud is an industry-leading interactive map provider who has been building location-based solutions for organizations for a decade. Are you trying to find a simple solution to provide your users with an interactive map of your school, city, or business? Well, NewCloud's interactive map platform gives you the power to make and edit a custom interactive map in just minutes. They have a team of professional cartographers who specialize in map illustrations of many different styles and are ready to design an artistic rendering to fit your exact needs. One map serves all of your users' devices with responsive maps that are designed to scale and blend in seamlessly with your existing website. To request a demonstration or to view their portfolio, visit them online at nucloud.com/drunkenux. That's nucloud.com/drunkenux.
Thanks for listening this evening, where we talked about project management and a lot about Agile and a little bit about government. Without being political, mostly.
Hope you found something useful there. Yeah. Hey, and we did a good job of not being political. I'm very proud of us for that. Hope you found something useful there and that you can apply it to one of your projects or
November 1st, open enrollment.
Open enrollment starts November 1st. Go check it out. If nothing else, go look at how different the site is from 5 years ago. You can go follow us on Twitter or Facebook or a Podchaser at /DrunkenUX. Yeah, it's just it's another podcast platform, but you can drop us a rating or review if you feel so inclined. We certainly would appreciate it. It only takes a minute and helps us out. You can also check us out on Instagram at DrunkenUX Podcast, where we will post pictures of our drinks and background stuff and show announcements and all that too. So it's a good place to check us out. Or come chat with us. We are on Slack. Just go to drunkenux.com/Slack and you can catch us over there. Let's see. What else do we got, Aaron?
Wednesday, RTO.
Wednesdays are RTO. We got real-time overview with news roundup every Wednesday, except the one in the middle of the month where we do a new episode of Build Process.
You know what I'd like to know as a parting message? Michael and I have been talking about what to do for our last episode of this year. So like the season finale for this year. And I had said that I thought we should release it on like either the 23rd or the 24th of December, so that when people are traveling or cooking or doing other things, if they're so inclined, they could listen to that episode. But I don't know if that's actually what people would do. So my Ask Aaron for this week, or Answer Aaron, is I would like to know, were we to release a season finale for this year sometime in like mid to late December, when would you be most likely to listen to it? That's what I'd like to know.
Maybe we'll throw a little poll or something up in the show notes. Might be able to make that happen.
I like that.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the show. And I only have one last thing I think that I need to say, and that is, as always, do keep your personas close and your users closer.